Ever notice how some people, like, you give a detailed instruction manual and they're in heaven, right?
Yeah.
But others just want like the box of parts and the freedom to figure it out themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like that with so many things.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder, like, what's going on there? Like what makes people tick differently when it comes to learning and just approaching new stuff?
Yeah, totally. It's
Yeah.
fascinating, right? And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today.
Yeah, so like think about it this way. You're tackling a new project at work maybe, or a creative project at home. Do you crave that clear roadmap step by step, or are you more excited by that chance to kind of wander down different paths and see where you end up?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that fundamental difference in how we approach things, that's what we're calling intellectual style.
Exactly. And it's about so much more than just how you think. You know, it touches on your feelings, your preferences for working alone or with others, all of it.
Right. It really gets at the heart of who you are as a learner and a thinker and even a problem solver.
Totally. So today we're going deep into this idea of intellectual style with some pretty fascinating research.
Absolutely. We're going to be looking at a model that tries to bring together a lot of different threads in this field.
Yeah, and the goal here isn't to like pigeonhole anyone you know, but to really help you understand how your own unique preferences shape the way you learn and think and interact with the world around you.
Exactly. It's about self-awareness and maybe even figuring out how to leverage your strengths in different situations.
I like that. So to kick things off, why don't you give us a little background on intellectual style? What exactly are we talking about here?
So, at its core, intellectual style is your preferred way of tackling challenges and processing information. It's how you naturally lean when you're faced with something new.
Okay, so it's not just about smarts.
Right.
It's more about your approach.
Exactly. And when researchers started looking into this, they noticed some pretty clear patterns. Like some people are drawn to highly structured situations, Give them a checklist and they're happy.
Right,
Yeah.
totally. Whereas others kind of feel stifled by that. They need that freedom to explore.
Yeah, exactly. And you see this play out in all sorts of ways. Like some folks prefer simple, straightforward solutions, while others are drawn to complexity. They want to really delve into the nuances.
I could definitely relate to that. And then there's that whole thing about rules, right? Like
Right.
some people are all about following the established guidelines, while others are more driven by their own intuition and insights.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And it even extends to how people prefer to work. Some are happiest flying solo, while others thrive in a collaborative environment.
Right. It's like that whole introvert extrovert thing, but applied to learning and thinking.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember these aren't like black and white categories. It's more like we all fall somewhere on a spectrum for each of these preferences.
Okay, so this is starting to paint a pretty interesting picture. But I got to say, there's a lot of different terms floating around out there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like cognitive style, learning style, thinking style.
Yeah.
What's the deal with all that?
Yeah, it can get a little confusing, all right? There's been a ton of research in this area, and different researchers have used different terms, sometimes even overlapping terms, to describe similar concepts.
Okay, so it's kind of like everyone's speaking the same language, but with slightly different accents.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. And that's where this deep dive gets really interesting because we're going to be exploring a model that tries to bring a lot of this together.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So it's called the Threefold Model of Intellectual Styles, and it was developed by two researchers named Zhang and Sternberg.
Okay, and what's the main idea behind this model?
Well, instead of just focusing on one specific type of style, they wanted to create a framework that could encompass a lot of the different ideas that were out there. And their goal was to not just categorize people, but to really help us understand how all these different preferences might be interacting and influencing how we learn and think.
That's ambitious.
Yeah.
So are they saying that all these different styles are basically the same thing, just with different labels?
Not quite. They actually address that head on. It's one of the big debates in the field. Like, are these styles truly distinct or are they just different ways of describing the same underlying tendencies?
That's a great question. And what do they conclude?
Well, we'll get into the specifics later, but their model actually tackles three major controversial issues in the study of styles.
Okay, wait, I'm on it.
So the first one is that question we just talked about. Are these styles different or similar constructs? The second is, are styles more like fixed traits, or are they states that can change and adapt over time? And the third is, are these styles value-laden, meaning some are inherently better than others, or are they value-free?
Wow, those are some pretty big questions.
Yeah.
So how does the threefold model approach these debates?
Well, it offers a really useful framework for thinking about all of this. But before we jump into the specifics, it's helpful to have a little historical context.
Okay, so take us back in time. When did people start getting really interested in this whole idea of intellectual styles?
Well, there was a period back in the mid-20th century that some people called the golden age of styles research.
Okay, and what was happening during that time?
Well, researchers were starting to really explore individual differences in how people think and learn. And there was a lot of excitement about the potential implications of this research. Like,
Yeah.
could we use this knowledge to improve education and help people reach their full potential?
Sounds like it had a lot of momentum. So what happened? Why did things slow down?
Well, like with any new field of study, there were some challenges. Some of the early research was criticized for not being very rigorous, and there were also a lot of different models and theories popping up, which made it hard to see the big picture.
Okay, so it kind of got bogged down in the details.
Yeah, in a way. And then there are also some philosophical debates about the nature of styles themselves, like those big questions we talked about earlier about trait versus state value laden versus value free. Those got pretty heated.
I can imagine. But it sounds like there's been a resurgence of interest more recently.
Oh, absolutely. And I think part of that is because we've had some time to digest all that early research. And there's also been a growing recognition that understanding individual differences in learning and thinking is really crucial, especially in today's world where we're constantly being bombarded with information and having to adapt to new situations.
Right. It's like having a personalized toolkit for navigating all that complexity.
Exactly. So there's been a real push to try and integrate all these different pieces of the puzzle. And that's where the threefold model comes in.
Okay, so it's building on all that previous research and trying to create a more unified understanding.
Yeah, exactly. It's taking all those interesting observations and trying to see the bigger picture.
I like it.
Yeah.
So before we dive into the specifics of the threefold model, can you give us a little overview of some of those earlier attempts at integration, just to set the stage?
Absolutely. So one of the earlier models that tried to bring different ideas together was Curry's onion model.
The onion model. Okay, I'm already intrigued.
So this was back in 1983, and Curry proposed that intellectual styles were kind of like an onion. They had layers.
Okay, I can see where the name comes from. So what were these different layers?
Well, at the very core, she put personality, like those fundamental traits that make you you.
Okay, so that's like the innermost layer.
Exactly. And then surrounding that core was a layer of information processing, how you take in and make sense of the world around you.
And this is all influencing your intellectual style.
Yeah, exactly. And then the outermost layer was instructional preferences, like how you prefer to learn.
Okay, so those are things like whether you like lectures or hands-on activities or studying alone versus with a group.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea was that those outer layers were more malleable than the core personality.
So like you might be able to change your study habits, but your underlying personality is going to be more stable.
Right. And Curry even hypothesized that the personality layer was like the most fundamental. It was what she called psychometrically essential, meaning it was the most important factor to consider when studying styles.
Okay, so that's a pretty intuitive model. It makes sense. But has it held up over time?
Well, it's an interesting framework, but the full model hasn't really been thoroughly tested to see if it really holds water.
So it's more of a starting point than a definitive answer.
Yeah, exactly. But it was an important step in trying to integrate different ideas about styles.
Okay, so what came next?
Well, in 1987, a researcher named Miller came up with his own model, and he focused specifically on cognitive styles.
Cognitive style. So that's about how we think and process information, right?
Exactly. And Miller was particularly interested in the spectrum of analytic versus holistic thinking.
So whether you tend to break things down into parts or see the big picture first.
Exactly. And he considered things like how we perceive information, how we remember it, and how we think about it as being key cognitive processes.
Okay, so he was really zeroing in on those mental mechanisms.
Right. And he argued that people who were more analytic tended to approach tasks in a very step-by-step way. They'd break things down into their component parts and analyze each part separately before putting it all back together.
And holistic thinkers are more likely to start with the big picture and then work their way down to the details.
Yeah, exactly. And Miller's model was influential, but it's important to note that it wasn't really based on a huge amount of empirical data.
So it was more of a theoretical framework
Yeah.
than something that had been rigorously tested.
Yeah, it was more of a heuristic device, a way of organizing our thinking about these two contrasting styles.
Okay, so Kind of like a mental shortcut or a rule of thumb.
Exactly. And it mainly dealt with styles that were at opposite ends of a scale, what we call bipolar styles.
So like analytic versus holistic. That makes
Mm.
sense. But what about styles that might be more multifaceted?
Right, and that's one of the limitations of Miller's model. It
Yeah.
didn't really capture that complexity.
Okay, so it was a step forward, but still had some gaps.
Yeah. And then in 1991, Riding and Shima came along with their model.
Okay, and what did they bring to the table?
Well, they proposed two main dimensions of cognitive style.
Okay, get me.
So the first one was holistic analytic, which we've already talked about. That idea of seeing the whole versus the parts.
Right, so they were building on that earlier work by Miller.
Exactly. And their second dimension was verbal imagery. So whether you tend to think more in words or in pictures.
That's interesting. So, like, some people might form mental images when they're trying to solve a problem, while others might talk themselves through it.
Yeah, exactly. And to measure these two dimensions, they actually created a tool called the Cognitive Styles Analysis, or the CSA.
Okay, so they were really trying to make this practical and measurable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things they reported was that these two dimensions were independent of intelligence.
So you could be really smart and prefer to think holistically, or you could be really smart and prefer to think analytically.
Right. It wasn't about how smart you were, but how you preferred to use your smarts.
That's fascinating. Though later on, some research suggested that their tool, the CSA, needed to be a bit longer to be really reliable.
Yeah, they found that a longer version of the test gave more consistent results.
Okay, so maybe a little tweak to the methodology.
Right. But overall, their work definitely had a big impact on the field.
Yeah.
It got a lot of people interested in researching cognitive styles, and it also highlighted the importance of having reliable ways to measure these things.
Okay, so this is starting to feel like we're building a pretty solid foundation for understanding these different styles.
Yeah.
Now, what about that third model you mentioned, the one from '95?
Ah, yes. That was Grigorenko and Sternberg's model, and they took a slightly different approach. Instead of trying to come up with their own dimensions of style, they decided to try and categorize all the existing research into three main traditions.
Okay, interesting. So what were these three traditions?
Well, the first one was what they called cognition-centered styles.
Okay, and what does that mean?
So these styles were seen as being very similar to abilities, things you're good at.
Like having a knack for problem solving or being really good at remembering names.
Exactly. And they were often measured by tests where you try to perform your best, like you're trying to get the highest score possible.
Okay, so that's like a traditional cognitive ability test.
Yeah, exactly. And a good example of this would be Witkin's work on field dependence independence.
Can you remind us what that's all about?
Oh, sure. So field dependence independence is about how much you're influenced by your surroundings when you're trying to focus on a task.
So like if you're trying to study in a noisy cafe, are you able to tune out all the distractions or are you easily sidetracked?
Exactly. And Witkin found that some people were really good at blocking out distractions. They were what he called field independent.
And others were more influenced by the context. They were field dependent.
Right. And he argued that this was a pretty stable characteristic.
So something that was kind of hardwired into your personality.
Yeah, that was his initial view, but we'll come back to that later.
Okay, so that's the cognition-centered tradition. What about the second one?
So the second one was personality-centered styles.
Okay, so these are more about your typical patterns of behavior.
Exactly. And they're often measured by questionnaires or surveys that ask you about how you usually behave.
Like those personality tests you see online.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And a classic example of this would be the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator.
The Myers-Briggs. Oh, yeah, everyone's heard of that one. So remind us what that's all about.
Well, it's a personality test that categorizes people into 16 different types based on 4 dimensions.
Okay, and what are those dimensions?
So the first one is extroversion versus introversion. So where you get your energy from, whether you're energized by being around people or by spending time alone.
Right, okay. And then there's sensing versus intuition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's about how you prefer to take in information, whether you focus on concrete facts and details or whether you're more drawn to abstract ideas and patterns.
And then thinking versus feeling.
Yeah, so that's about how you make decisions, whether you're more logical and objective or whether you're more guided by your values and emotions.
And the last one is judging versus perceiving.
Right, so that's about how you approach the outside world, whether you prefer structure and order or whether you're more flexible and spontaneous.
Okay, so that's a pretty comprehensive system.
Yeah,
And it's all about understanding your typical patterns of behavior.
exactly. And then the third tradition that Grigorenko and Sternberg identified was activity-centered styles.
Activity-centered. So these are about how we approach different tasks.
Right, and this is where things like learning styles come in.
So, like whether you prefer to learn by listening or by doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or whether you're someone who likes to dive deep into a subject or whether you just want to learn enough to get by.
Right. And there are even styles related to how we approach problem solving.
Absolutely. Like some people are really methodical and step by step, while others are more intuitive and leapfrog around.
So it's really about your preferred way of engaging with different activity.
Exactly. And what's interesting about Grigorenko and Sternberg's model is that they acknowledge that these three traditions aren't completely separate. They overlap in certain ways.
So it's not like you're either cognition-centered or personality-centered or activity-centered. You're probably a mix of all three.
Right. And their model tried to capture that complexity. However, they did note in their paper that this particular model hadn't actually been tested very much at that point.
So it was more of a theoretical framework than something that had been rigorously validated.
Exactly. But it was another important step in trying to integrate all these different ideas about styles.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We've talked about the history of styles research and some of the earlier models that tried to bring different ideas together. Now can we finally get to the star of the show, the threefold model?
Absolutely. So as we've seen, these earlier models gave us a foundation, but they also had their limitations.
In what way?
Well, some of them focused on very specific types of styles,
Mm-hmm.
like Miller's model, which mainly looked at bipolar styles.
Right, and others didn't have a ton of research to back them up, like Curry's onion model.
Exactly. And they didn't always directly address those big debates we mentioned earlier, like trait versus state and value-laden versus value-free.
Okay, so the threefold model is trying to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, exactly. And to understand the threefold model, we really need to start with Sternberg's theory of mental self-government.
Mental self-government.
Okay, that sounds intriguing.
So Sternberg came up with this theory back in the 1990s, and he argued that just like a country has different ways of governing itself, we have different ways of managing our own mental activities.
So, like some countries are democracies, while others are monarchies. We each have our own internal government.
Exactly. And these different ways of managing our thoughts and actions, that's what he called thinking styles.
So these thinking styles are like our preferred modes of mental self-government.
Exactly. And Sternberg was really clear that these aren't about how good you are at something. That's your ability.
Okay, so it's not about your IQ. It's about how you use your IQ.
Exactly. And to describe these thinking styles, he used this government metaphor with 5 different dimensions. 5 dimensions. Okay, so this is getting pretty detailed.
Yeah, he really broke it down.
Ah.
And within each dimension, he identified several different thinking styles.
Okay, so walk us through these 5 dimensions. What are they?
So the first dimension is function. And this is all about what you like to do with your mental abilities.
Okay, so like, do you prefer to come up with new ideas, or do you prefer to follow existing rules?
Exactly. So within the function dimension, he identified 3 main thinking styles.
Okay, tell me about them.
So the first one is legislative, and this is the style of people who like to create their own rules and approaches. They're the ones who say, hey, I don't need your instruction manual. I'm going to figure this out my own way.
Okay, so they're the independent thinkers, the innovators.
Exactly. And then there's the executive style.
And these are the folks who prefer to follow the rules.
Right. They like having clear guidelines and procedures to follow. They're the ones who say, just tell me what to do and I'll get it done.
Okay, so they're the reliable ones,
Yeah.
the ones who get things done efficiently.
Exactly. And then the third style in this dimension is judicial.
Judicial. So these are the judges.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. They like to evaluate and judge the quality of things. They're the ones who are always asking, is this good? Is this right?
Okay, so they're the critical thinkers, ones who are always looking for ways to improve things.
Exactly. So that's the function dimension.
Okay, so 3 different styles within that dimension. Now, what about the second dimension?
So the second dimension is form. And this is about how you organize your thoughts and actions.
Okay, so like, are you a list maker or are you more free-flowing?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So within the form dimension, Sternberg identified 4 main thinking styles.
Okay, let's hear 'em.
So the first one is hierarchical. And this is the style of people who like to prioritize and organize their tasks. They're the ones who naturally create hierarchies and systems.
Okay, so they're the planners, the organizers.
Exactly. And then there's the monarchic style.
Monarchic, so these are the kings and queens.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. They're very focused on one goal at a time, and they don't like to be distracted.
Okay, so they're the laser-focused ones, the ones who get things done one at a time.
Right. And then there's the oligarchic style.
Oligarchic.
Mhm.
So these are the ones who rule by committee.
Yeah, in a way. They're comfortable juggling multiple goals at the same time, but they don't necessarily have a clear priority.
Okay, so they're the multitaskers, the
Yeah.
ones who can handle a lot of different things at once.
Exactly. And then the fourth style in this dimension is anarchic.
Anarchic, so these are the rebels, the ones who don't like any rules.
Well, not necessarily. They just take a more flexible and sometimes random approach. They might jump back and forth between tasks, or they might come up with their own unique way of doing things.
Okay, so they're the free spirits, the ones who like to do things their own way.
Exactly. So that's the form dimension.
Okay, 2 dimensions down, 3 to go. What's next?
So the third dimension is level, and this is about the scope of your thinking.
Okay, so like, do you focus on the big picture or on the details?
Exactly. So within the level dimension, there are two main thinking styles.
Okay. Okay,
So
good.
the first one is global. And this is the style of people who like to see the big picture. They're the ones who are always thinking about the overall context and how things fit together.
Okay, so they're the visionaries, the strategists,
Exactly. And then there's the local style.
and these are the detail-oriented folks.
Right. They like to focus on the specifics. They're the ones who are good at spotting errors and inconsistencies.
Okay, so they're the meticulous ones, the ones who make sure everything is just right.
Exactly. So that's the level dimension.
Okay, 3 down, 2 more to go. What's next?
So the fourth dimension is scope. And this is about how you interact with others.
Okay, so like, are you a team player or do you prefer to work alone?
Exactly. So within the scope dimension, there are two main thinking styles.
Okay, lay them on me.
So the first one is internal. And this is the style of people who prefer to work independently. They like to have control over their own environment, and they don't like to be micromanaged.
Okay, so they're the introverts, the independent thinkers.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Yeah.
And then there's the external style.
And these are the extroverts, the collaborators.
Right. They like to work with others. They enjoy bouncing ideas off of other people, and they're good at building relationships.
Okay, so they're the team players, the ones who thrive in a social environment.
Exactly. So that's the scope dimension.
Okay, 4 down. Last one. What's the 5th dimension?
So the fifth and final dimension is leaning. And this is about your attitude towards change and novelty.
Okay, so like, are you a risk taker or do you prefer to stick with what you know?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. So within the leaning dimension, there are two main thinking styles.
Okay, let's hear them.
So the first one is liberal. And this is the style of people who are open to new ideas and experiences. They're the ones who are always looking for ways to improve things, and they're not afraid to challenge the status quo.
Okay, so they're the progressives, the innovators.
Exactly. And then there's the conservative style.
And these are the folks who prefer tradition and stability.
Right. They like things to stay the same. They're not big fans of change, and they prefer to stick with what's familiar.
Okay, so they're the traditionalists, the ones who value consistency and predictability.
Exactly. So those are the 5 dimensions of Sternberg's theory of mental self-government.
Wow, that's a lot to take in 5 dimensions, and within each dimension, multiple different thinking styles. So how does this all relate to the threefold model?
So the threefold model essentially takes all these different thinking styles that Sternberg identified and groups them into 3 broad categories.
Okay, so it's simplifying things a bit.
Yeah, in a way. But it's not just about simplifying. It's about trying to see the underlying patterns and connections between all these different styles.
Okay, I'm following you. So what are these 3 broad categories?
So the first category is type I intellectual styles.
Type I. Okay. And what defines a type I style?
So type I styles are characterized by a preference for low structure, a comfort with cognitive complexity, a tendency towards nonconformity, and a desire for autonomy.
Okay, so these are the folks who like to think outside the box. They're not afraid of ambiguity, and they prefer to forge their own path.
Exactly. And if we look back at Sternberg's thinking styles, many of the styles we've already talked about would fall into this category.
Like which ones?
Well, for example, legislative thinkers who like to create their own rules would be type I.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those global thinkers who like to see the big picture?
Yeah, they would also be type I, as would hierarchical thinkers who like to prioritize and organize their own tasks.
Okay, and what about those liberal thinkers who are open to new ideas and experiences?
Yep, they would also be type I.
So it's like all the styles that emphasize independence, creativity, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And one of the interesting things about type I styles is that they're often associated with positive adaptive values.
Mean what?
Well, in many cultures and societies, these styles are seen as being beneficial.
So like they're associated with success and innovation.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, it's important to remember that context matters, but in general, type I styles are often seen as being valuable.
Okay, so that's type I. Now what about type 2?
So type 2 intellectual styles are kind of the opposite of type I. They prefer structure, simplicity, conformity, and authority.
Okay, so these are the folks who like clear guidelines and predictable outcomes.
Exactly. And if we look back at Sternberg's thinking styles, we can see that executive thinkers who like to follow rules would be type 2.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those local thinkers who are detail-oriented?
Yep, they would also be type 2, as would monarchic thinkers who like to focus on one goal at a time.
Okay, and what about those conservative thinkers who prefer tradition and stability?
Yep, they would also be type 2.
So it's like all the styles that emphasize following the rules, being organized, and sticking with what works.
Exactly. And one of the things that's interesting about type 2 styles is that they're often associated with more negative adaptive values.
Meaning what?
Well, in many cultures and societies, these styles are seen as being less desirable.
So like they're associated with being rigid or inflexible.
Yeah, in a way, of course it depends on the context, but in general, type 2 styles are often seen as being less valuable than type I styles.
Okay, so that's type I and type 2. And what about type 3? You mentioned there were 3 categories.
Right, so type 3 is kind of the wild card. They exhibit characteristics of both type I and type 2.
Hmm. Okay, so they're like a hybrid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And their preferences can really vary depending on the specific task and what interests them personally.
So they might be really independent in some situations and really rule-following in others.
Yeah, exactly. And sociological preferences also play a big role here.
You know what?
Well, things like whether you prefer working in a group or independently.
Okay, so that's more about your social preferences than your cognitive preferences.
Right, and these sociological preferences can really influence how your intellectual style manifests.
Okay, so can you give us some examples of type 3 styles?
Sure, so if we think back to Sternberg's thinking styles, oligarchic thinkers who are comfortable juggling multiple goals would be type 3.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those anarchic thinkers who take a more flexible approach?
Yep, they would also be type 3, as would those who are both internal and external in terms of their scope.
So they're comfortable working both independently and collaboratively.
Exactly. And one of the things that's unique about type 3 styles is that they're what the model calls value differentiated.
Meaning what?
Well, it means that their value really depends on how they're used and the specific situation.
So they can be beneficial or detrimental, depending on the context.
Exactly. So those are the 3 main categories of intellectual styles according to the threefold model.
Okay, that's a really helpful overview. So now can we finally circle back to those 3 big controversial issues that you mentioned at the beginning?
Absolutely. So the first one was, are these styles traits or states?
Right, so are they stable aspects of our personality, or can they change and adapt over time?
And the threefold model argues that intellectual styles are primarily states.
So they're more fluid than fixed.
Exactly. And while you might have certain natural tendencies, these styles are seen as being modifiable through things like your experiences, your education, and the social environments you're in.
So like if you're constantly being rewarded for following the rules, you might become more of a type 2 thinker over time.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Okay.
And there's actually research to support this idea. For example, studies on Sternberg's thinking styles have shown that people can learn to use different styles more effectively,
Okay, so it's like you can train your brain to be more flexible.
in a way.
Yeah.
And findings from other models also support this idea. Like there are training programs designed to help people become more field independent or more reflective in their thinking.
Interesting. So even something like field independence, which Witkin initially thought was a very stable characteristic, can be modified through training.
Exactly. And even Witkin himself later acknowledged that his initial view might have been too rigid.
Okay, so that's one debate settled. Styles are primarily states, not traits. Now what about the second issue? Value-laden versus value-free.
So the threefold model argues that type I and type 2 styles are predominantly value-laden.
Meaning that some styles are inherently better than others?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. But in general, type I styles, with their emphasis on things like creativity, complexity, and independent thinking, are often associated with positive outcomes.
So like they're linked to things like higher levels of self-esteem and more advanced cognitive development.
Exactly. On the other hand, type 2 styles, which focus more on conformity, simplicity, and following rules, tend to be linked with more negative outcomes in many educational and professional settings.
So like they might be associated with lower grades or difficulty adapting to new situations.
Yeah, that's a possibility. However, it's really important to remember that what's considered positive or negative can depend a lot on the specific situation.
Right, so a Type 2 style might be perfectly fine in a job that requires a lot of attention to detail and adherence to protocol.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right fit between your style and the demands of the environment.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about Type 3 styles?
So as we talked about earlier, type 3 styles are considered value differentiated.
So their value really depends on how they're applied and the specific context.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand your own individual style and how it interacts with your environment.
So you can play to your strengths and work on developing areas where you might need to be more flexible.
Right. And the threefold model gives us a really helpful framework for doing just that.
Okay, so that's 2 debates down. 1 to go. What about that last issue? Whether these different style labels are really describing distinct concepts.
So the threefold model concludes that while there are definitely overlaps between different style constructs, they're not all just different names for the exact same thing.
Okay, so they're not completely separate, but they're not completely identical either.
Exactly. And this is based on empirical studies that have shown correlations between measures of different styles.
So like if you score high on a measure of field independence, you're also likely to score high on a measure of legislative thinking style.
Yeah, that's a good example. And these correlations suggest that there are some shared underlying elements to these different styles.
So like there's some common thread that runs through them.
Exactly. However, each style construct also retains its own unique aspects.
So it's like they're all part of the same family, but they each have their own individual personality.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the threefold model recognizes that complexity. It doesn't try to oversimplify things.
Okay, so that's the final verdict. Styles are distinct but related.
Exactly. And the threefold model gives us a really helpful way to see those connections.
Okay, wow. This has been a really deep dive into the world of intellectual styles. So to sum it all up, the threefold model provides a way to see how all these different styles relate to each other. It suggests that they're generally adaptable states rather than fixed traits. And it proposes that most styles, particularly type I and type 2, tend to have inherent values associated with them, while type 3 styles are more dependent on the context.
Exactly. And what's so great about this model is that it has a lot of practical implications. Well, for starters, can help us understand our own learning and thinking preferences.
Right, so like
Yeah.